The MAGA and Russian pick for president of Romania has lost in a complete upset. It was a total surprise. Take a look at this video, which we can tell you a little bit more about it.
The latest is that Nicos Jordan will be Romania's next president. We've heard in the past few moments that is the cheering you can hear for it. He leads this election runoff against George Simeon by more than 900,000 votes. And the official commission says that there are now only slightly more than 800,000 ballots to be counted. In other words, George Simeon cannot get to the total that Nicos Jordan has reached, so we know that Dan will be Romania's next president after a campaign that has divided this nation between those backing a populist, nationalist, hard-right politician, a young man with not much political pedigree, but with a view of changing this country, of saying that it was that he was the anti-establishment candidate, picked against Nicos Jordan, the mayor of the city of Bucharest, a 55-year-old, much more experienced politician, pro-West, pro-EU, someone much more from the political center.
To help us understand this situation more, I've added my friend who is a foreign policy expert, dare I say, Griffin Phil, to help us explain what the context is for this situation. And I have some related images to show you as he explains it. Griffin, my first question for you is, what background information do we need to understand so we can understand how important this outcome was?
So I think the first thing I'll say about Romania's election here is it's a rare case of what should have been a two-part election became a three-part election. This election should have happened last year. The first round this was supposed to be the 2024 Romanian presidential election. The guy on the screen now, Călin Georgescu, was expected to win. He had won the first round. If the second round had happened in 2024, it was probable that he was going to win. He was a really extremist populist figure, generally right-wing, but right-wing only in the modern sense that he was anti-establishment, pro-Russia, super fringe. I mean, he was convinced that he was talking personally with aliens, that the globalists were, this.
So a mainstream Republican, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, more and more every day. But it was really just these bizarre fringe conspiracies that, frankly, most Romanians really didn't believe. But he was seen as this, man from the countryside and a real salt of the earth Romanian. And he was also a massive liar in his campaign finance statements. He said he spent no money on the campaign. In fact, millions of dollars had poured in, both from these sort of sketchy outside sources and also more darkly from other political parties in Romania that were convinced that they could use him as a spoiler candidate to ruin other people's chances to getting into the second ballot. But he flagrantly broke Romanian election law, and the entire election was annulled by the Romanian Supreme Court. And there was a new round ordered in early 2025.
So I was told that was a coup by the liberal deep state, and they would never give up power. But then it's kind of weird. They had an election not even that long later. Kind of strange.
Yeah. I think the MAGA Americans and some of the other sort of far-right populists in Europe definitely used it to fit their own existing story about how European politics work. They like this idea that the Europeans are woke illiberals and that the Brussels bureaucrats in the EU are secretly controlling everyone's national politics. And I won't deny it's a jarring thing to see someone who won the first round of an election be disqualified. But the fact is that the Romanian institutions and their system actually worked.
Yeah, it's kind of jarring to me to see somebody who broke laws and was in politics and was actually held accountable. I'm still reeling from that discovery, but yeah, it's very strange how they do it over in Europe. Now, tell me a little bit more about the right-wing candidate in this election just 1 year later. I got a picture for everybody right here. As you can see, he's holding a Trump hat. Who is this guy? Why is he doing that?
So this is George Simeon. He won the first round of the election, which was he was not going to if during the first round, but he basically collected all the voters from Georgescu, and he represents, I would say, a marginally more mainstream version of the far right. He has existed in Romanian politics for a lot longer. His whole idea was this union with Moldova and annexing their neighbor of Moldova to try and create a greater Romania that was focused on ethnic Romanians. And he was very closely associated, unlike Calin Georgescu, who's very much the sort of bizarre outsider that no one outside of Romania had much to do with before. Simeon has been a staple of the far right scene outside of Romania. He attended CPAC. He knows Don Jr. He is
so yeah. I just in case anybody's wondering whether Griffin is reliable, as y'all can see, this is Don Jr., the classic, the best Trump, some say, the most iconic, and that's this guy. So he's not only like a right-wing populist nationalist. I mean, there's a lot of those guys in Europe, but he's one that openly associates with MAGA. Why does he do that? Is he ideologically pretty much the same? I mean, I just find that kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's been this bizarre situation where you've seen with a lot of these European far-right populists, some of them, like Nigel Farage, are more reluctant to get involved with Trump because they think he's so unpopular in their home countries that it's actually an electoral liability. But in Ukraine, Trump's actually pretty popular. They don't really know much. In Romania, I meant to say. In Romania, he's actually pretty popular. They don't know much about his politics really, but he's seen as a strong man and a tough guy. And a lot of European right-wingers like that. Less in Western Europe, but much more in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, Eastern Europe was always the worst part of Europe anyway. But yeah, pretty MAGA guy. He wins the first round, and by win, it doesn't mean he won a majority. He just got the most votes. And then in the second round, the runoff, a different person wins. This guy. So who's this guy, and how did that happen?
So this is Nikishor Dan. He is really just about the exact opposite of Simeon. He is, as the clip said, he is in his mid-50s. He's a very soft-spoken, mild-mannered. He graduated with a PhD in mathematics from the Sorbonne. He is the former mayor of the capital city of Romania, Bucharest. He is really a sort of centrist to center-left technocrat who's very much focused on economic growth, supporting the EU, the transatlantic relationship with the United States, and supporting the Ukrainians. So he is exactly the sort of person that MAGA dislikes. They would see him as a sort of Brussels EU woke mainstream politician who's just part of the establishment.
So terrible, so terrible. So how did he manage to win? Whenever a lot of people were expecting the more right-wing candidate to end up prevailing in the second round.
So Dan's actually an interesting figure because, the MAGA people will say, oh, he's super establishment and, he's just part of the deep state in Romania. He's really not. He's actually a reformist in his own right. He's not a member of any of these sort of establishment parties that have dominated Romania since the end of communism. He represents a sort of younger generation of Romanian politicians who are actually sick and tired of the corruption and incompetence and inefficiency that have been a real problem in Romania. So he was able to successfully appeal to many Romanians that actually also wanted change, because most Romanians do want change. There are serious problems in the country that need to be addressed, but it really represents a dichotomy about how do you go about that change. Is change done by technocratic people who are focused on economic growth and practical, tangible solutions to the real problems in your country, or is it
demagogue populists?
Yeah, culture warring firebrands and demagogues. And in Romania, the technocrats and the moderate reformists, they won, which is an interesting experience. It'll be interesting to see if he's able to really deliver on what the Romanians want, because Romania wants change, or whether he'll end up being a Biden type figure that is sort of the last gasp of the establishment that ends up being disappointing to many people that expected more change or expected something different.
Well, but also people usually don't like what they get, right? So they ask for change, and if you don't give them enough change, they're not happy. And if you give them too much change,
they're not happy either.
They're upset. And really, like, the character of the change they're asking for is often a character of change that they're actually not comfortable with whenever it occurs. Like, you see this with Trump. Everybody says, "Oh, tariffs are great." Now we have them. A lot less popular, right? A lot less
Yeah.
popular whenever you actually do the thing you're promising. So it's totally possible that the right wingers win in the following election after this one. But the real question is, well, are they actually going to be any more popular another at the next election cycle, right? Is the technocratic approach one that's genuinely inferior politically to the populist approach? I'm not really so sure about that. Now, this election occurs in a broader European context, and it's part of maybe a broader game of the balance of power between NATO, the West, right, which used to include the United States, less so these days, and Russia, right, which is constantly trying to assert more control over the continent. So, can you explain how important this election is, and a little bit more about the broader European tug of war in terms of the power battle between Russia and NATO?
Yeah, so really, since I would say since the Arab Spring and mass immigration into Europe, combined with the sort of fallout of the 2008 economic crisis, we've seen this sort of slowly rising tide of populism in Europe. And a number of times, people have prematurely declared the populist wave was over. In like 2017 and 2018, the rise of populism slowed periodically, and people thought, "Oh, that was the high tide of populism in Europe." And then it came up again, and then it receded a little bit more, and now it's coming up again, and now this is another defeat for populists in Europe. But the question will be is if this is the exception or if it is really the high point, because across Europe, in France, Marine Le Pen, in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, even in Hungary, Viktor Orban has been the sort of the model populist state, and we've seen more and more countries drift towards populism. What's been interesting to see is the role that these individual European populists take on the world stage. And some of them, as you talked about with the Russians, someone like Viktor Orban are pretty unapologetically closer to Russia. He would certainly object to the phrase pro-Russian, and he would say he's pro-Hungarian.
Yeah.
One might even say he wants to make Hungary great again. But in practice, this sort of neutral rhetoric about finding a place between NATO and Russia really, in tangible terms, is very much favorable
Well,
to the
see,
Russians.
both the invaders and the defenders are equally bad, Griffin. That's what you don't understand.
Exactly. It's
But there's different people like Maloney, which you might bring up in Italy, which is
yes,
a populist right-wing candidate, which really seems, from a foreign policy perspective, pretty indistinguishable from the traditional kind of European type, from the technocrats and the liberals and the social democrats. We have another image here. Explain this for us.
yeah. So this is just sort of the a very simple and very straightforward map of just how significant these populist and hard right groups have become in Europe. And in some cases, what it means to be hard right is sort of difficult to say. Like, look at the map with Slovakia. They say, it's the hard right is polling first. Slovakia has a extremely populist and radical prime minister. Very debatable whether they're far right or far left. They're far something, but they're extreme anti-establishment. And that's something that we've seen more and more in Europe is, the continent after World War II was so scarred by fascism and then just terrified of the communists to the east that there was this sort of deep moderation in European politics, social democrats, Christian democrats, but the system generally could survive with a relatively narrow ideological band. Now it seems like just decades of frustration with the political establishment is boiling up, and it's just general anti-establishment something. Something needs to change.
I think populism is generally appealing to people. And by populism, let's be very clear about what we mean. It is a form of politics which is pretty negative, very much anti-status quo, and tends to point very directly at certain bad guys, right? Whether they be like opaque bad guys, the deep state, whatever that means, or immigrants, right? Or the bureaucrats, or the rich, the capitalists, right? And over time, we developed bad taste in our mouth with certain types of populisms, right? So fascism, a lot of fascist narratives. People would hear it after World War II and they'd say, that sounds a lot like the people that we know that are bad, right? And then during the Cold War, whenever we heard leftist populism, people were like, oh, that sounds a lot like the communists, right? So we don't like that. But I think populism is intrinsically appealing to a large portion of the population, usually the less educated, less nuanced, working class folks. That's how the coalition has generally been historically. And since we're reaching an era where those memories, the bad tastes in our mouth that we had about communism and to a greater degree fascism, we're forgetting those bad tastes. That populist inherent intrinsic appeal is kind of returning, right? And so the hope is that we can kind of just remind people like, hey, we don't really want to try this again. The alternative situation is, well, actually, maybe populism just has to take over the world again, and then, like, I don't know, barely get defeated. Like, it doesn't just set up authoritarian countries all over the place, and everybody will remember for like another 100 years that this was a bad idea, and then we'll have another 100 years of success.
It's not a great commentary on the voters' memory that you need a world war and a nuclear armed totalitarian Soviet Union to give people a few decades of memory of just how bad political extremism can be.
Yeah, we can have a good time for a little while, and then we need to
it's fun while it lasts. And you talked about earlier Russia, and I think it's worth saying here at first, and I pointed to immigration and economic stagnation as causes here. Those are very significant and very real, and I will say the primary causes of far-right populism and anti-establishment sentiment. But the Russian government also plays a really significant role, especially in Europe. The extent to Russian involvement in U.S. elections is obviously very much object of contention. But more generally, I think it's fair to say in the U.S. that there has been significant foreign involvement in our elections. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, TikTok, things like that, money, social media influence. These things have had an impact pretty indisputably. And in Europe, it's all the more significant. Le Pen in France was dogged by these constant accusations of financial ties to the Russian government. She, it seems like, probably accepted Le Pen's party. They would take out like low interest loans from Russian banks to fund their projects, and then maybe not pay them back ever. So it was, it was campaign finance donations through defaults on loans from Russian banks, which is
basically
a grants system.
Just basically cash transfers.
Yes.
To the far right in France. Remarkable. You mentioned earlier that it's contested whether Russia's mid-meddling in our politics. I think it's very clear. But in Europe, it's really undeniable. Like, if you're denying it in Europe, I mean, that you're denying the evidence of your eyes and ears.
The extent to which the Russians have really infiltrated the European information space is pretty shocking. Like, you don't see it in the U.S., but until the war in Ukraine, if you were in Europe and you turned on a TV in Europe, you would easily see Russia Today in the local language, which is the Russian state propaganda outlet aimed towards the outside world. And the Russians
think they would know better. It's literally labeled Russia Today.
You would think so. But I guess it said RT, and that was close enough that people wouldn't realize it was Russia Today. And for the Russians, and thank you for flipping this slide, this is very helpful. The Russians have really taken this sort of two-part approach to dealing with the Europeans. And first of all, has been this way, as you would call it, information and political warfare. And that's, I guess, it's no surprise. Putin's a former KGB man. He likes the idea of spying and using these sort of subtle tactics to undermine their enemies. And you have to remember that in the Russian mindset, they think that the Cold War wasn't lost fairly. That they didn't lose on the battlefield. They weren't nuked. They were there was this information diseases that infected the Soviet Union and caused its fall. And for the Russians, they see it as sort of this poetic strategy of trying to infect the West with our own information diseases. That they think that, well, if it worked on them, which that wasn't our fault, that was their own ideology catching up with itself. But in their mind, the Soviet Union failed because of the West and our games we played against them. And if
maybe it failed because it wasn't working, right? That's my radical theory.
Yeah, but they're not going to. A bunch of former KGB guys aren't going to be talking about the failures of the system. It was someone else's fault. We weren't good enough at being brutal security autocrats. We should have been harsher. That's the lesson. It's no coincidence that Putin thinks Stalin was a pretty cool guy. He has issues with communism, but his issues with communism are with Lenin, not with Stalin. He's an admirer of the brutal totalitarianism. But on the map here you see this is sort of the other half of the Russian strategy against the Europeans. So all of Europe they try and undermine with these information wars, but closer to themselves, what the Russians call the near abroad, or what they insist is their sphere of influence, which, in the Russian sense, the just sphere of influence is everything east of Berlin, which is it's a bold claim for a country of 150 million people, which John McCain famously once called a gas station with nukes. Their strategy has been essentially provide these constant irritations that prevent the normalization of what's happening in these countries. You can see in Moldova, there's Transnistria, which is this ethnic Russian separatist state, which the Russians
really
have
weird place, right? 'Cause
peacekeepers.
isn't it sort of still communist? My sister's husband is one of the few people who's actually been to Transnistria, and I've seen pictures of it. It's still technically like the People's Republic of Transnistria, right?
It's in their mind, it's the last province of the Soviet Union. The Transnistrians essentially exist in an alternative universe that's still mid 1991, and if they had it their way, it would stay that way forever. But the Russians have peacekeepers there, and you see again and again the Russians love peacekeepers. They're never there to really keep the peace. They're there to keep the status quo, which favors Russia. And,
keep control.
Yes,
it's weird how every time Ukraine it's weird how every time Ukraine gets invaded, it's by peacekeepers. I find that a little bit strange.
Yes, and it's not just Ukraine. Moldova, the Transnistria, as we said, but also in Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are two provinces that the Russians invaded in 2008. And between the Armenians and the Azeris, the Russians also tried to take advantage of the ethnic conflict between those two countries to play them off against each other, so they would both be constantly looking to Russia for support. Once the war in Ukraine started, the Russians were forced to give up that, and the Azerbaijanis just invaded and took it, because now the Russians could no longer dedicate the troops to that. And I think it plays the part that the Russians aren't actually that strong. They play a very, very aggressive hand with a pretty... They play a very, very aggressive game of poker with a pretty weak hand, and their strategy has essentially been to bluff the West and assume, so far correctly, that the West doesn't really want to deal with this and would much rather focus on their internal problems, or, turn populist and rip themselves apart internally, which for the Russians is just bonus points. But really, one commonality we've seen between populist politicians in the West and establishment politicians in the West has been that neither side have taken the Russians seriously enough. And they've allowed the Russians to go far further than they should be able to, given the actual size of their economy or military.
Right. So actually, many of the populists have seen Russians as allies. You look at Tucker Carlson, he talks about how Russia's on the better side in the Ukraine war. They talk about how conservative Russia is, right? And it's more in line with their ideology, which is an authoritarian, centralized, oligarchical state. So basically dystopia. Maybe they're right in making that a sort of assessment, but the crimes of the liberals and centrists and center left of Europe is much less severe by comparison. Their problem is they just don't really want to use all their power to combat the Russians, right? They want to slow walk aid to Ukraine. They don't want to actually take on confrontation. They want to acknowledge that Russia is their primary geopolitical foe, and so they shouldn't be doing tons of business with them. That's what they did historically. Germany, the famous mistake,
Nord Stream,
heavily on Russian gas and helping develop infrastructure to increase that reliance. Complete idiocy. But I don't want to get too far. I don't want to get too far from the results of this election. There's a final clip I want to show y'all regarding the right-wing candidate that lost. In typical Trumpian fashion, he declared victory anyway. Let me pull up this video real quick.
Having conceded defeat on Sunday night, George Simeon, following pressure from his supporters on TikTok, will now sue to get the presidential election results cancelled, citing interference by France.
International observers saw interference not only from the Republic of Moldova, but also from the French state. Social media was manipulated and algorithms were used to influence Romanian citizens.
The pro-Russia candidate was relaying accusations by Pavel Durov, co-founder of Telegram, who has said he's willing to testify. Durov took to the social media platform X on Sunday to directly accuse French intelligence services.
This spring at the Salon des Batailles in the Hôtel de Crillon, Nicolas Lerner, head of French intelligence, asked me to ban conservative voices in Romania ahead of elections. I refused. We didn't block protesters in Russia, Belarus, or Iran. We won't start doing it in Europe.
Allegations which French intelligence, which has admitted meeting Durov on several occasions, took the unusual step of denying.
The CEO of Telegram, okay, this guy says that France is going around cooing all the countries. They decided that the CIA is no longer in the business of cooing. And so now it's their job to coup the rest of the countries in the world. Is there any validity to that claim?
No. So Telegram has had issues with French intelligence and European intelligence in the past. This is really to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sort of broader discussions around what companies are being influenced by the Russian state and the Russian security services. The European intelligence services, I think, are pretty accurately convinced that Telegram and Pavel Durov in particular are uncomfortably close to Putin. And they've had some real issues with him in the past, and they've been applying pressure to try and prevent Telegram from being used as a weapon of the Russian state. This is very much just an attempt by Durov to try and distract from those credible allegations by the Europeans and say that it's just it's a European plot to undermine democracy, and French intelligence is actually puppeteering Romanian elections, which is
you would think
really
they would come up
pretty
with
outrageous allegation.
a more plausible bad guy. It's interesting, that guy, the Telegram guy, pretends like he's some sort of nonpartisan, non-biased person who's just trying to keep Telegram a neutral platform, and he believes in free speech. Every single political message he has ever expressed is right-wing, very right-wing, frankly. He's very open on his Twitter, right? Like the Twitter is the platform by which he used to express this message about how impartial he is. And you could just go read his tweets and you're like, wait, this guy's not impartial at all. This guy's very, very much partial. Now, the guy originally, the right-wing candidate in Romania, originally declared victory. Now it seems like he's pulled that back, but he is challenging the results. So, basically the same thing.
He doesn't really seem to know what to do, because on one hand, he still has longer-term political ambitions. I think he imagines himself much like Trump, someone that could come back a third time. And, he'll take another shot at it in 4 years and see what happens. So he doesn't want to completely discredit himself, but he also wants to discredit himself a little bit to get all the supporters that are anti-establishment. And it's a difficult position because he wants to be anti-establishment and accuse the system of lying enough to get the conservatives to stay with him. Because if he just admits defeat, they're going to all walk away and they'll find someone who's more radical in 4 years. So he has locked himself into this position where he needs the support of extremists. So he has to do things that are extreme. And in this case, that means just saying, no, I actually won. Why not?
Well, also, everybody always tosses out the loser. So it's really convenient to say, I'm not the loser. But if you go too far, people get really...
Who wants to lose?
But if you go too far, people start getting really scared, like you saw on January 6th. For a period of time, whenever people remember what happened, they're like, oh my God, you're trying to coup the government. That's so crazy. And they don't like you for a little bit. And then they totally get over it like 2 years later. Griffin, thank you so much for coming to help us understand something going on the other side of the world. Folks, the summary here is a right-wing candidate in Romania lost. We can celebrate that, but there's a lot more work to do. There's plenty of right-wing candidates and right-wing parties doing well around the world, and it's on all of us to do our part to stop them